Hello and welcome to the regular meeting of the Larkspur City Council on Wednesday, May 20th, 2020. We're getting started a few minutes late for technical difficulties because we're all attending via video conference only, and you have the opportunity to join us tonight to make public comment or to listen in, and all of that information is available on the Larkspur City website under agenda items. And Allison, our city clerk, is here to accept public comment. And if you look on the front page of our agenda item tonight, you will see all of the links on how you can email the city clerk at cityoflarkspur.org and how you can make comment at cityoflarkspur.org. So we're really working hard to try to keep this open and accessible to our community to participate, not only to listen, but to provide their sources of feedback. So we'll start with a roll call. Allison?
Councilmember Campbell.
I am here.
Councilmember Hilmer.
Here.
Councilmember Paulson.
Here.
Vice Mayor Haroff.
Here.
Mayor Way.
Here. I thank you. We'll move on to item number 2, which is public comment. This is a time for members of the public to address the City Council for items that are not on tonight's agenda. And recall, so that it's not on the agenda tonight, we have very limited opportunity to make comment on it, but we could refer it for a future agenda item. And I see we already have 2 public comments that have been submitted in writing earlier, and those are available on our website. Public comment from Dabowski and public comment from Pike. We won't be reading those because those are available for those to read and will be maintained on our website. Allison, do we have anyone who has not submitted a written comment on an item not on the agenda who would like to speak tonight?
Thank you. Yes, we have both written and people raising hands. So I'll start with the written comment received. This is from Anna Harrison. Please consider intervening with impending June 1 rent increase at Marin Park. It is my understanding no rent increases are allowed during this time of shelter-in-place hardship. Thank you, Anna Harrison.
Thank you.
And then we have a public comment from Mitch Powers. Mitch, I will unmute you. It is your turn for public comment. And you'll need to unmute yourself on your end.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, thank you. Okay, my name is Mitch Powers. I live at Marin Park. As everyone knows, the residents of Marin Park have suffered from a series of unprecedented 8 to 10% rent hikes since the new owners took over in 2017. We've been having ad hoc meetings with Gabe, Kevin, Dan, I think Allison was at 1 or 2, and the owners of Marin Park to discuss rent stabilization. At our last ad hoc meeting on April 14, we discussed the upcoming rent hike, which amounts to about 8 to 9%, starting this June 1st. We asked for a postponement, especially in light of the COVID-19 situation. As Vice Mayor Kevin said, Marin Park owner Christine is committed, quote unquote, is committed to putting something on paper, and that Christine was to circulate a draft. We have seen nothing. Apparently Gabe has spoken to Christine, but we have heard no details nor received the postponement proposal as promised. Any day now, we will receive our rent invoices for June. Gabe says there will be some sort of proposal included by Marin Park owner Christine. How does this qualify as a draft that we can all look over? These types of last-minute tactics by Marin Park owners are not conducive for an open dialogue. Personally, I feel like we need to get back to the bigger discussion of rent stabilization for Marin Park. But yes, my immediate concern is this proposal that we haven't seen yet that will be in our mail just a week and a half or so, or a week before our new upcoming rent increase. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for your comment. And I think when we do council member reports, it could be addressed at that time. or an update at that time. So please listen in for that. Is there anyone else in the audience who would like to make a public comment at this time?
I see no further raised hands, and there's been no further emailed comment.
Okay, so like I've done in the past, we're getting better at this, but I'll come back to you one more time, maybe after our next item is completed. That brings us to number 3, which is presentations and proclamations. We don't have any tonight. Takes us to 4, which is the consent calendar. Are there any council members who would like to pull an item from the consent calendar for discussion? Seeing none, I see that we had a late attachment to the cooperation agreement on 4.3 that was submitted or added to the agenda on 5/19 and available for people to view. Other than that, I don't see any other changes. Sky, a question for you. Since we've had an addition to the consent calendar, do we need to pull that separately to vote on?
No, it's sufficient just to acknowledge that it's been added.
Okay, so I acknowledge.
And include that in the motion to approve it.
Okay, and is there anyone from the audience that has raised their hand to want to pull an item from the consent calendar?
Yes, we have one emailed comment regarding the consent calendar. This is regarding item 4.1 warrants from Dennis Gilardi. Please provide background discussion on the bike path rent paid to Sean Nazari. Is not the bike path a public right-of-way? End of comment.
Is that information readily available, or should we come back to that later?
I can answer now if you'd like, Madam Mayor.
Sure.
There's a portion of the public bike path that's on the property that Mr. Nazari represents that is private property, and the city has a long-standing lease to have a public bike path on that particular stretch, and so that's the rent payment.
Okay, are there any questions on that? All right, that brings us to approval of the consent calendar. Do I have someone, a council member who would like to move the consent calendar?
Sure, I would love to move you.
Let's see, looks like I saw Scott first, and is there a second? Gabe? Sounds good. Did you get that, Allison?
Yes, I'll do the roll call now.
Yes.
Councilmember Kandel?
Yes.
Councilmember Hilmer?
Yes.
Councilmember Paulson?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Haroff? Mayor Way?
Yes. All right, that moves us to 5, the city manager's oral report. And Dan, before you get started, I'd just like to acknowledge for the public that the city manager has an emailed weekly, sometimes twice a month manager's update that you can register on our city website to get notification when that comes out and get it directly into your email. So I would suggest everyone who is interested sign up for that. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and council members. It's been quite a busy time on a number of key fronts in terms of administration for the city. Most notably, been working as one of the managers for the Central Marin Police Authority and the Central Marin Fire Authority to put together and present to the respective councils of those boards, of those agencies, their budgets, which were both approved at their meetings last week. I want to thank my colleagues in Corte Madera and San Anselmo for their work on those budgets, and of course the Chief Norton of the police and Chief Schertz of the fire agency. I wanted to take this opportunity for those who may not pay close attention to the scintillating fire authority board meetings that we have, that Chief Schertz has elected to retire and will be retiring at the end of June. And I wanted this opportunity to acknowledge that the consolidated agency that is Central Marin Fire came about in large part because of the work that Chief Schertz put in to marry the two departments together to build trust among two communities and the two fire departments. And he leaves behind a tremendous legacy. And I know we'll have other opportunities will bring him forward, but I want to take this opportunity tonight to thank him in advance of what I imagine will be a celebration for him. It is so difficult in this new environment to celebrate departures like this in the way that we're accustomed. So lastly, I wanted to note that the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority is well underway. That's the recently passed County Measure C funded agency. I represent you on the Operations Committee, which has held 2 meetings already in preparation for the agency's first board meeting tomorrow, and preparing a lot of the material that will be presented. And Councilmember Paulson sits on the full board of that authority. I also just want to remind folks, we are into fire season, so be thoughtful about your property and your neighborhood, and we encourage everyone to look into our neighborhood response groups and get involved. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you. And do I have any questions from the council for the city manager? No? I just want to comment that I appreciate the hard work of both the city managers of Corte Madera and Larkspur and San Anselmo to get a very good, thoughtful budget for our main expense, which is our public safety, and for the police department to have held their expenses level for the next upcoming year, and for fire to also have made considerable effort to do that, and with some staff changes. So that represents almost 51% of our Larkspur city budget. So it's very important that they were able to work well with us on that. So let's move on to council member reports. Who would like to begin? Just raise your hand if you want to begin. How about Scott? Good.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to report Gabe and I were on the committee for the Larkspur Corte Madera School District, an advisory committee. They're dealing with the same budget issues that everybody is. They have to come up with some ways to make it through next year with a lower amount of expected funding. It was a fantastic group, very diverse, including teachers, administration, parents. Everybody was able to have a say. We had a very truncated schedule. We had 5 meetings within about 2 weeks, and we were able to go through just about every possibility and come up with some recommendations. The recommendations were really in the form of a list of priorities of what we would recommend being cut, and from, I think there were about 11 things on the table, 1 through 11, and I think the committee did a fantastic job. I want to thank everybody on the committee for doing that, putting the time in. It was a lot of time for a small period for 2 to 3 weeks. It was a lot of meetings. So thank you, everybody, for doing that. And I think we came out with some good information. So I'm happy about the way they worked out.
Great. Councilmember Hilmer, do you have any reports or updates? Oops. Oh, he froze. Do you have any reports or updates, Dan?
I said I have nothing to report this evening, Madam Mayor. Thank you.
You know, sometimes the audios fluctuate depending on what's going on. Councilmember Paulson?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I just had 2 minor items. One was, I think Vice Mayor Haroff is going to report on the business chamber, but I really just wanted to express my gratitude for everyone who's been working. I'm just an alternate, but I've been talking to the director, and I wanted to call out Julie has just been doing so much, and all the donors. I think Kevin will get into that, but it's been great to see our council and our chamber really stepping up and trying to help the businesses. So more on that with Kevin's report. You know, in reference to the public comments, there have been so many more committee assignments for me, and the Marin wildfire is coming tomorrow, and the MCCMC for business recovery. So I just want to express my, feelings for the people who called in and recommit to to being more in touch. So I've been trying to be in touch with both the Marin Park administration and with the residents there, and I'm going to do a little bit more of that this week and try to keep everyone posted. So I appreciate your patience. I really want to see a good resolution here, and we'll be in touch. So more on that later. And that's right now. Thank you.
Kevin? Oops. Is it just me or can I not hear?
No, can't hear him either.
Kevin, you're offline.
I'm should be back.
You're back.
You're back.
Sorry. I try to stay mute as much as I can. So Gabe kind of covered a couple of things briefly, and I'm glad you mentioned the MCCMC effort to engage communities throughout Marin County in economic development and opportunities. We've had a couple of calls, I think, at this point, and it's been productive. I think we still have some work to do in order to pin aspects of what we want to accomplish in that context down, but at least we're working together, so that's great. So the other side, which has also been actually a little more active with respect to Larkspur, is the Chamber of Commerce. So as you all know, I am now both Larkspur's representative and a member of the board, and Gabe is there working with us and has been really showing some really great leadership and moving some aspects of that forward. But we've been very successful, and I join in what Gabe said about Julie's contribution and work to move forward a specific funding opportunity, a GoFunding proposal, which is, it's not even a proposal, it's there, which is very similar to what other communities have been doing throughout Marin County. We've been successful through contributions from the Larkspur Community Foundation, from the city, from individual donors, and I think we're pushing pretty close to about $50,000 in terms of monies that are available within that funding mechanism. So the idea there is to create access to, modest but meaningful grant opportunities for local communities, which will help not only support businesses who are already participating in the chamber, but will provide an enticement, I think, for other businesses to join the chamber and be more supportive of our Larkspur business community. So over what was the last conversation we had, Gabe? It was like, I can't remember. I'm losing track of the days. It was either yesterday or this morning, one or the other. But like I said, they've got close to $50,000 committed, and we will be working through that. And we are at par, if not beyond, what some of our neighboring communities are in terms of their similar efforts. And I just think it's great because it all kind of came together in a week. So kudos to those involved in that process.
Thank you very much.
If I could just add a couple things. Yeah, I wanted to a few more gratitudes. I wanted to thank our city manager because of significant, perhaps half of that funding, the county city money, and Dan really helped make that. That should materialize, and then the Larkspur Community Foundation for really stepping in as well. And then there's so many donors. If you go to the GoFundMe site, there might be 50 or 60 or 70 people who've donated, and including our mayor. So thanks to everybody, and it's been really wonderful to see it come together.
And your vice mayor, although somewhat more modestly than our mayor.
Well, all right, thank you very much. So since we last met, it's been very busy, and I think we don't often report out to all the minutia and details of the daily activity of your council and your city manager and your city staff, but they have been working around the clock most of the time to deal with these changing rules and changing environment with COVID-19 and the shelter in place has caused and created for all of us. So I'm going to really focus as we go forward on getting more information out to the community so they can realize how really diligently we're working on all of these matters. And it's such a fluid and changing environment that I have to commend the staff to stay as present and as efficient as they are. So let's see, since we last met, like we said, we had the fire council meeting and the police council meeting and voted on a budget. And that's completed for this year. And kudos to all of that staff for putting together a very thoughtful budget. I've always felt that our need to make sure our first responders are number one in our thought process for where we allocate our funds, and that came through in those meetings. I also want to tell you I attended the community block grant awarding of federal and state funds. This has been a role that Ann Morrison played for the last several years as our council member. So the decisions and the presentations have been going on for several years. I attended at their sort of grant night money where they gave out allocated funds, but we just re-upped our contract with them in our consent calendar tonight. So we will be participating with them going forward for the next 3 years. I wanted to let everyone know that Kevin and I have been doing interviews of our board and commission members who are interested in re-upping for their volunteerism to our boards and commission. And we've been doing those through our GoToMeeting platform. And we've interviewed Park and Recreation, Heritage, and it looks like we will have some openings on the Planning Commission. So I want to put that out there, see if anyone in the audience or in the community is interested in stepping forward for Planning Commission. Second to the last thing is our ad hoc finance committee met this week, which is Kevin, Vice Mayor Haroff, myself, Dan Schwartz, and Kathy Orm, and we also have an emeritus council member who helps with that, Larry Chu. So you'll hear more about that tonight, but we are continuing to meet as needed to help brainstorm some financial issues that the city is facing and give guidance as an ad hoc committee. For the community, it's really important to follow what's happening with COVID-19 at marinrecovers.org. It's changes every day, and that's a central source to find information as well as our website. And second, two more things. Everybody will be getting a defensible space letter in their mailbox. If you're a resident of Larkspur, Greenbrae, or Kentfield, this arrived in my mailbox today. Defensible space and home evaluation inspections are starting really soon. So it's very important that we pay attention that we are facing probably a significant fire risk this year, and we don't want to lose sight of that. But this will be found in every resident's mailbox, hopefully within the next few days. Please read it and do what we need to do to create defensible space. One last thing, tomorrow, our library director, Franklin Escobedo, and myself will be doing a Zoom in with Supervisor Katie Rice at 5 o'clock. She's doing Zoom ins for residents and city, invites city council members to participate. And I ask that we take this opportunity to introduce our new library director. And so we will be meeting at 5 o'clock. There's an invitation online for the community to ask questions. It's all District 2, and it's not just Larkspur Greenbrae residents, but Franklin joined us in January and then hasn't had too much time to had the library open. And I really think it's an opportunity for him to share with the community how Larkspur is supporting our residents through our online learning and through our online library. And one last thing, another shout out to Larkspur Community Foundation for stepping up and really participating, not only with messaging and support for our communities and our business community, but to really use their connections and their resources and their email list to get as much information out how we can support our Chamber of Commerce. That's it for me. Allison, at this time, is there anyone else who has entered our meeting who would like to make public comment?
I'm looking for any raised hands. I'll give people one moment. And it looks like no, there's no further public comment.
All right, thank you. So that we'll move on. No public hearings tonight. That's number 7. That brings us to number 8, which is the meat of our meeting tonight. We'll be doing a fiscal year 2021 budget review, preliminary budget. And that is available for those who are online to look at, and it will come up on the screen too. But it is downloadable and viewable on our website. I'll turn that over to City Manager.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm working on getting it up and running here. Okay. Oops. All right, everybody can see the presentation?
And for those who, unless you have a question or need, we can mute our mics. It just provides less feedback.
So before I begin, I want to first acknowledge the hard work of Administrative Service Director Kathy Orm, who is present and available to answer the detailed questions should you want to dive into any of the specific line items this evening. This is a modified approach to our budget process. In the past, we've done 5 sessions. We usually start with a lighthearted chit chat about what the departments have been doing, and then we do a look at the economy, and then we do some early cuts of department level budgets, and then we conclude with the citywide budget. This year we've taken a different approach in light of what's happening. At your last council meeting, for the benefit of those members of the public who were not able to attend, we did more of the 10,000 foot view of the preliminary budget. We emphasized themes and percentages and talked about the assumptions that we were building into the budget. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time tonight revisiting those assumptions. There's a few I want to underscore, but for the most part, let the presentation from the last meeting stand, and happy to discuss those as we go forward. With this presentation, we want to dive into the more specific numbers, give you a sense of where the budget looks like it's going to land, take direction from you about anything you see in the budget that you either have questions or concerns about and would like us to go noodle some more before we bring you a final budget. And then I want to talk at first blush, I'm going to do a presentation of what we see the effect being on our ability to serve the public. There's a combination in that discussion of the COVID-19 impacts and the fiscal impacts. We'll bring a more refined and service level discussion as part of your final budget hearing, but wanted to give you some perspective on what the departments are talking to me about in terms of how they'll operate in the coming fiscal year. Also, I believe most of the department heads are present, so if you have department level questions, we'll tap them to respond. Okay. So there were some assumptions I just wanted to remind the council and underscore for anyone who didn't see our last presentation, and then about our revenues. We're making some critical assumptions that drive our budget in terms of estimating what sort of shortfall we're going to experience in the economy as it stands now. And the 4 major assumptions that are built into the budget are: 1, that property tax will actually go up, and that's based on information provided by the Marin County Assessor's Office, which has an excellent track record in its analysis and predictions of how property tax will move. Sales tax we're projecting down 40%, and that's based on a combination of looking at where things have started to trend as data is now arriving, and then applying what we're reading from experts in the sales tax field in terms of trends. And we're applying those trend assessments to what we think will happen with the Marin economy in particular, and the Larkspur economy specifically. Transit occupancy tax, this is our hotel tax, we're assuming will be down 80%. Most experts are predicting that hotel taxes will drop 60 to 80%. So we've elected to choose the more conservative end of that spectrum for our budgeting purposes. And then planning and building, as I mentioned in the last presentation, this is probably the assumption that would be most open for debate if we put 100 people in the room who are versed in this information. It's very difficult in these early days of such an unusual situation as COVID-19 to know what people are going to do with respect to projects, with respect to work done on their existing property. History tells us that activity in planning and building drops significantly in a recession. Folks tend to hold on to their cash a little more as they try to assess what's going on in the economy. And so we think it's prudent to assume a significant decrease in planning and building fees. And we looked back to the last recession for guidance in terms of making the assumptions that we have. So the council received a memo yesterday outlining both the narrative and numbers what the preliminary budget looks like. You also have, quote unquote, on the dais tonight, we emailed you a summary of revenues and expenditures in a single sheet. It's a fairly digestible, readable document. And I see that Allison, being the efficient clerk that she is, has already posted that to the website. So our viewers who are watching the webinar, if you take a minute to go over to our website, you can actually call up a one-sheet summary of the budget in brief. So this is, in sum, the budget in brief with respect to revenues. And as you can see, we are expecting declines in all categories other than property tax. And as you can see, for some of these categories, these are very significant drops that we're anticipating. In total, right now we're showing that we're around 2.4 million in terms of difference. These numbers are slightly refined from the numbers that were distributed to you, I believe, in the packet last evening, as Kathy's done some additional minor tweaks and adjustments. But the scale is still the same challenge for us. It wouldn't be one of our presentations if we didn't have one of Kathy's pie charts. So I'm taking away her talk tonight and doing a quick review of some of her information, and we can revisit the pie chart at any time if you'd like. The blue, the dominant color, is property taxes. We're very fortunate that the major source of revenue for the city is property tax, given the assumptions that I've laid out for you. But it also shows you that we are, for 25% of our budget, our revenue is reliant on these other sources and very sensitive to these other sources in terms of the types of services that we can offer. So what are we doing to reduce expenditures in this budget? I want to take a minute to acknowledge the Larkspur Miscellaneous Employees Association. That is the group that represents the vast majority of our employees. They came to the table knowing that we were facing a problem and embraced the fact that that Kathy and I were pushing to make decisions sooner rather than later so that we could begin to deal with what we saw on the horizon. They worked closely with us, asked a lot of questions, made some suggestions to us, and we've resulted in a plan for next year in terms of staffing that has significant but manageable impacts across the board. First and foremost, we've agreed that all base pay for all employees will be reduced by 10%. To accomplish that for the represented employees, those are the LMEA employees who are effectively hourly employees subject to FLSA, the Federal Labor Standards Act. The employees will furlough for 10% of their pay, meaning that they will take 10% of their hours, their regularly scheduled hours, they will take as leave with no pay. For the salaried employees, so that's the management group and myself, our pay will be reduced by 10%. Salaried employees work whatever schedule they need to work to get their work done, so their pay will be reduced by 10%. In total, that's roughly $500,000 reduced out of the budget for next year for operating costs. We also talked about the service level impacts and our ability to operate if we left positions vacant that are currently either vacant or the occupant of that position has accepted the offer for early retirement that the council facilitated when it approved the early retirement incentive program last month. As a result, we will be holding 5 positions that were in the past year's budget. We will be holding them vacant and unfunded. What that means in terms of how we document these positions is we're still going to show them on our organizational chart as positions that we need to operate at our normal standards, but we are leaving them vacant and not including the allocation in the budget to fund them. 2 of those positions are librarian positions. We were actually in the process, in the final stages of hiring a librarian, unfortunately, when all this started. But we're going to leave those 2 positions vacant. I'll be talking a little bit more about operations in the library in the COVID world. We have a library assistant who will be retiring, and we'll leave that position vacant. We have a permit technician. That's one of our people that works on our community development counter, our planning and building counter. One of those positions, the person is retiring, and we'll leave that position vacant. And then we had allocated and funded a public works inspector for this current fiscal year. We were actually struggling to fill it, and we had finally found a candidate right when the shelter-in-place order was announced. We're now going to leave the position vacant and unfunded and continue to outsource the work to a third party, which is our past practice. Ultimately, we do think we can capture more efficiencies and be more cost-effective in the long term to bring that in-house, but for the time being, we'll continue to use our contractor as we wait to see what the actual demand for that work will be. In total, all of those staffing changes will reduce the expenditures versus the current fiscal year. They'll reduce the expenditures by about $1 million. We're doing one other key thing to reduce our expenditures versus the current fiscal year. The city recently issued pension obligation bonds. In doing that issuance, we were able to negotiate that the first 2 years of the bonds, we would only make interest payments on the bonds. We won't make any payment on principal. This pension obligation bond issuance was used to pay off our sizable unfunded liability debt with CalPERS, the pension system for our employees. By paying off that sizable debt and refinancing, our overall costs over the lifetime of the debt are going to be reduced by about $9 million. But what's helpful for us in the current fiscal year is that the amount we're paying toward that debt will be reduced by $700,000 because we will only be making an interest payment against the bonds. Again, you have the blush of the.
I'll interrupt you for just a second, and before you get in, since that is where our reductions are being, is there any questions of the council members of that section of his presentation? There's a lot of numbers going to come at us tonight. I want to make sure.
So I did real quickly. This is Kevin. Just real quickly, just on slide or two before on the staff salary reductions. And first of all, thank you for being generous in your own agreement to do that. I just was wondering how some of the other communities in Marin and maybe elsewhere in the Bay Area is this comparable to what other communities are doing? Are we in the middle? Are we on the upside, or where are we?
It's not an apple. It's a bit of the oranges comparison. I think you're going to see a lot of 5% furloughs, but with those furloughs, you're also going to see a lot of the other compensation that employees receive frozen or cut. We've focused heavily on base pay with our employees, and the percent number worked for us there. We're allowing other elements of our compensation to remain untouched.
Okay, but in a general way, are we, I mean, acknowledging that we all have our own approaches to what we need to do given the characteristics of our community? Are we seeing similar overall pay and salary reductions throughout the area?
No, again, so some of the communities won't make pay cuts because their solution to their budget deficits are all very different. So I've spoken to some of the cities on the Belted Peninsula, for example, or San Anselmo out in the Ross Valley, where their reliance on sales tax is extremely low, and it doesn't make up 25% of the budget. So the need for them to ask their employees to help fill the gap is very different than the need for Larkspur. On the other end of the spectrum, you have Novato and San Rafael, and they're needing to work with their employees now to bring their costs down. And where they'll land, I couldn't say. We're ahead of them in terms of the negotiations we did with our employees. And then Sausalito is currently working with its employees to come up with numbers that can balance their budget or at least make their deficit manageable. So I don't yet know where exactly they're going to land. I think overall, the net impact to employees will all be within a similar range. The numbers and how that gets there and what the effect on everybody's compensation packages really will be city by city. And some cities have the sufficient cash on hand that they're going to try to ride this out. And that's their prerogative as well. And you are seeing some cities make that decision. So.
Okay, that's fine. I guess I've got what motivated my question was twofold. Was just to make sure that we're acting given the unique characteristics of our community in a manner that is perceived to be prudential relative to what other communities are doing, and in part to make sure that we're not creating challenges for us in the future in terms of recruitment for new positions. I know this has been an issue for some of the JPAs in the community. We need to make sure that we're not doing things that create problems for us in terms of making sure we're competitive in the marketplace. A year from now.
Hard for me to speak to that exactly till we see where every city lands. What I can only say to you, and I've committed repeatedly to our employees, is this money needs to be reduced out of our budget, at least for next fiscal year.
Yeah,
and
no, I understand.
The numbers, this is where we landed that makes it work.
Yeah, no, I understand. Thank you for that.
Did you have a second question, Kevin?
No, that was a combined question. So I think he answered both aspects of it.
Dave, it looks like you have something about in this section about the reducing expenditures portion of the presentation.
I still smell
I'm sorry.
What's that?
Not on my end.
ask questions, I think.
Yeah.
Gabe, do you have a
No,
question?
Questions. Dan, one was we had spoken earlier about the fire and police budget and Central Marin and how that had been passed. I'm assuming that there weren't any cost savings in that process, even though you mentioned the retirement of Chief Schertz and there may have been other staffing changes. So I'm curious if that is any part of this, or if you're going to talk about that.
I can talk about that. I didn't include it in this presentation. We talked about that a bit at the last meeting. So the instruction that my fellow managers for those two agencies gave to the chiefs was to work with us and with the finance officers for those agencies to make the charge that each member agency experienced be the same as the prior year. Now, to do that, each of those two agencies had to come up with a different solution. We had challenged them to that, saying we didn't want to see any cuts in personnel in our first responders in light of the COVID crisis, in light of the fire season, in light of just health and safety being our #1 priority. We wanted to see if we could manage their budgets in a way that we could handle and still have those people out helping our communities. For the police authority, there was a combination of things done. There were some one-time monies that could be moved around that were sitting in some accounts that we were holding that we were able to move out into the operational budget of the police authority to help defray increases in costs. And then we made some decisions to control some of our reserve levels and some of the insurance funds that we maintain in that authority to lower levels than we might normally like, but ones we felt we could manage in order to keep that budget flat. In the fire authority, Chief Shirt's retirement is actually a big part of how we were able to accomplish the same goal. And so Chief Shirt's had retirement somewhere in his vision, and he had that tough conversation with us about could we work together to figure out a way that he could retire that fit closer to his plans and would relieve the agency of that cost. So at the time, for when he retires, there will be an interim chief from within the ranks, and then we'll hold another position vacant that we believe we can do that and still serve the public satisfactorily. I should note the fire budget's actually going up quite a bit, but it's going up because of the infusion of monies from the Measure C tax that was passed. Larkspur and Cordillera are giving a rather nice sum of money for local use. We actually added a vegetation, I think it's called a mitigation specialist. We've actually added a new position to the authority whose specialty will be wildfire management, and he'll be fully committed to doing that within our two communities. And we think that's an excellent use of that money. But so I do want to say that while the cost to Larkspur has been held flat, the budget actually went up. And that's actually true of both agencies because of some of the ways we move money around in the police authority.
Thank you. And then one more question.
Oh, go ahead, Gabe.
Yeah, just one more question. The pension obligation bond, I think we voted a few meetings ago to authorize going to the market. And I was wondering if you could just provide a little more detail, because I know the market conditions changed, and in some of our 2019 meetings, we never thought of deferring principal. So I'm curious, the amounts seem fairly close to what we had hoped to get. And did we have to make any sacrifices, or it looks like it was actually a fairly good deal?
So what we did on the pension obligation bonds in order to negotiate the interest-only payments, which was a key part of our strategy now, was that we worked out with the issuers with our underwriters that the totality of what we save over the lifetime is within a few percentage points of what we otherwise would have had we not done the interest-only payments. And the way that was accomplished was by creating a little bit more aggressive payments down the road when we expect to be stronger again. Additionally, we put in some provisions so that if we're doing very well, we can actually increase our payments beyond the amortization schedule, essentially the annual bond payment. That was put in as another way to sort of deal with the fact that we were not getting off to the best start by only doing the interest-only payments. We landed, I don't have the percentages in front of me, but we landed at roughly a 3% overall cost for the interest on the bonds. And the other thing is, by doing the bonds, we're no longer subject to the performance of CalPERS with respect to our unfunded liability. It won't grow or move in any way because CalPERS is in trouble with its investments. So we now have a fixed debt, whereas before we had a moving target. And I feel really good about that in light of the fact that CalPERS is having some problems with its investment portfolio in this environment, although I haven't looked since the market came back strong in the last week or so.
I'll just remind everyone that when we initiated and reinitiated our finance ad hoc committee, we met right away with this topic and met with our bond consultant and some other financial consultants and really listened to Larry Chu's advice on CalPERS and the inability to feel confident that CalPERS will be treating the cities with the same level of information and evaluation as they've been doing. And remember, he wrote with John McCauley the pension twice the CalPERS analysis that was presented to the MCCMC. So I felt very confident that we were getting good advice on that position. And we enacted that early on, and I thought that was strategically a very important thing to do. So if there's no more questions, let's move on to the next part of your presentation. Oh, your section.
Thanks. Dan, I just had two questions. The first is, I'm looking at the attachment to the agenda that has all the details. Yes. And the positional cuts that you discussed jump off the page. You see salaries, in one department minus 120,000. It's very easy to see. The 10% reductions are a little bit trickier. Are they included in this as well?
They are, but they would be tricky to see because we don't have in that budget each individual employee broken out. We have it rolled up by department. So, but it is accounted for in there.
So in some of the departments where, for example, there's not a 10% reduction, that would be because somebody else was either hired or got a pay increase that made up for that 10%?
Yeah, well, let's use administration as one of the examples. While all the employees are having a 10% reduction, I actually forgot to put this in that memo, but we have one administrative assistant currently working for the city, and his time has been split 20 hours a week for administration and 20 hours a week for recreation. We're actually moving him entirely into administration next year. And so as a result, there's actually a big increase in the admin budget because his entire cost came into that department. So that's an example of why you wouldn't see sort of an across the board cut of 10% in the cost of the different departments.
Thank you for explaining that. I appreciate it. My other question was, we had previously discussed there was somewhere in the neighborhood of $500,000 that we were going to be using for our budget that came from a fund from the hotel tax. Could you just kind of remind me or us what is the total amount in that? What percentage are we taking, and what's left over?
Sure, and I do actually have that a little bit later, but I'll be happy to address it now. We looked at the Transient Occupancy Tax Fund, which is a fund that council set up well before my time, where we take for every dollar that we take in hotel tax, we put 10 cents into that fund, and we put 90 cents into the general fund. So it's been building up over time, and there were several years that we didn't spend any money out of that Transient Occupancy Tax Fund. So Kathy and I took a look at it and said, we can have slightly more than 1 year's reserve in that fund, and we can still then move $525,000 out of that fund and into the general fund. It's a one-time opportunity, but it will be able to offset a significant portion of the loss that we're going to realize until some level of tourism returns for the courtyard. So that's.
And I'm sorry, when you say, I was just going to ask, when you say 1 year's worth of reserves still in the fund, what numbers are we talking about?
We spend in that fund roughly $75,000 a year. So there's going to be, and Kathy, you may want to chime in, but what the balance would be in the fund. But I have in my head it's somewhere between 75 to 100,000 would be there after we make that transfer.
Thank you.
And just a reminder, we have one hotel in jurisdiction that we receive transient occupancy tax from, as opposed to some of the other cities, Sausalito, for example, which relies heavily on their TOT. Is there anything Kathy wanted to add to that, or are we good?
I am online. I would like to chime in with Dan as saying that he's correct. That's about where we would land at the end of the transfers, to have 1 year's worth, which is about 70-75 to our other commitments.
Okay, thank you. So let's move on from in your presentation.
Okay. I think I accidentally jumped over this before, so if I could quickly review. This is a big one, and we'll be talking a little bit later in the presentation about this, but this budget, although we show library and recreation broken out, we haven't had time to go into the back end of our budget and do some labeling. They'll no longer be separate departments, they'll be divisions, and they'll be divisions of a community services department. We'll be eliminating the recreation director position, at least at this time. The current recreation director will be retiring. And then the current library director will become the director of this department, and he will be the lead administrator for both the library and for recreation. We also have a librarian position that's currently filled that will be reducing the hours a little more significantly than the furloughs, and that's to sort of match where we see our operational need at this time. We're also proposing to modify the duties of 3 employees. One's the last one there on the list I mentioned is the administrative assistant. We're moving that person entirely into the administrative department, so that's the department that Kathy and I manage, as part of a move to bolster our support for the entire city with respect to communications, outreach, media use, multimedia use. The admin assistant will be deployed to each department on an as-needed basis to support them however they need with that type of documentation or technical support. He'll be working under assistant to the city manager, Shannon O'Hare, who I'll remind you is your communications officer. We'll be working actually to really bolster this year some of our online offerings in light of the transition that we're trying to make to a more online world. The assistant planner is currently a filled position, and we have proposed in this budget that we would leave the second permit tech position vacant, and we will be asking the assistant planner to perform duties that fall under both of those job classifications. The planning and building director, Neil Toft, will make decisions based on workflow as to the balance of planning work and building work that this employee will do. This is not what we would consider an optimal situation for either discipline. There are some very distinct differences. I did tell the incumbent today it's a great learning opportunity because some planners are remiss in the early part of their career of learning more about the building side of things. So I hope he'll take that to heart. But our ultimate goal is that when planning and building activity reaches a cost recovery level that we're comfortable represents a restoration of our previous activity, that we would split these positions back up and we would hire someone in the building division, and the incumbent would be restored to full-time planning duties. And then lastly, we talked a little bit about this at the last meeting. The senior planner will be taking code enforcement in-house, and she will be, in addition to her duties as senior planner, she will be dealing with a lot of the code enforcement issues for us. we currently outsource that to a third party, and that will produce a significant savings for the department. We also in this budget contemplate folding heritage more closely into the planning department budget and not calling it out as something that we would dedicate as much budget and staff time to. And we can talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. The senior planner position has long had a significant portion of its duties assigned specifically to heritage issues. And some of our decision making we might have been doing anyway, because heritage and heritage issues have been evolving in terms of how the city manages them. I'll speak a little bit more to that later.
Have we lost Kevin, or is he?
No, I'm still on audio, but my video went off, so I'm trying to bring that back up.
Thank you.
So staffing costs between all these changes, we've reduced about $1 million versus the previous year's or the current fiscal year budget. And then I mentioned the pension obligation bonds. We are reducing our payment toward our unfunded liability by roughly $700,000 for one fiscal year to help us through this time. So that brings us to an overall snapshot of the general fund expenditures, which you have captured in the handout that folks can also look at online. This version that's on the slide deck shows the percentage changes. And as you can see, in several areas, we've proposed some significant modifications and reductions in costs. And there will be substantial implications for service that we'll talk about shortly. In other areas, we've managed to hold the costs relatively flat. And we'll be working all throughout the year to continue to refine these numbers. One thing that I noted last presentation and I want to underscore, and I'll be talking a little bit more about it shortly, we have a vacant position in our public works maintenance crew. We are proposing to recruit and fill that position. We sometimes forget that our maintenance crew is part of our first responder team. And we were fortunate to make it through the most recent rain season short one man. And because it was a drier year, we were able to do that. But in a wet year, we need that extra body to cope with the flooding that takes place around our community. And so again, thinking and prioritizing health and safety, we are proposing to fill that. So you see that did cause actually an uptick in the Public Works Parks budget, which is part of the maintenance. And here's a pie chart to show you what the general fund looks like. As is typical for most communities, public safety makes up more than half of the general fund budget. What's unique about our budget is there's no detail for you. That's the charge that you'll pay to the two authorities that adopted detailed budgets for the police council and the fire council, respectively. So we just have to make sure that we're capable of making the payment that's been approved to those two agencies. So this goes to the question that Councilmember Kendall asked, which was how else are we going to close this gap? And there's a need now to look at one-time resources of reserves to close the additional gap that we see in the budget. You know, we basically project that we still need roughly $1 million to 1.1 and 1.2 million, depending on how our shortfall plays out. Because we have a significant reserve in the transient occupancy tax fund, I am proposing that we move $525,000 out of that fund to replace much of the lost revenue that the Marriott, the Courtyard Marriott will experience for us in terms of TOT. That leaves our balance on our shortfall around 600,000. And so that's going to need to be covered by the general fund reserve. We believe that the general fund reserve can handle that 600,000 and still meet the council's current threshold of having 25% of the general fund in reserve. And that may sound like a really big number to a lot of folks, but there's 2 points I want to make about the reserve. The first is, as anyone who listens to our budget talks knows, we are very focused on cash flow here, because 3/4 of our revenue is in the property tax, and property tax comes twice a year. We're also particularly concerned for this coming fiscal year because there's talks of 6 months of deferral being available to property taxpayers in the coming fiscal year. And if those deferrals materialize, it's unclear what that will mean for flow of revenue to municipalities. If it's anticipated by the state that municipalities will simply have to either do short-term borrowing or draw upon their reserves to manage their cash flow during that deferral period, it's all the more important that Larkspur, which is often challenged in its cash flow, hold on to a significant reserve. But perhaps the more important point that I want to emphasize this evening is that for the gap that we're closing in the proposed budget, 1.2 million of that gap are in one-time opportunities, and that's the transfer from the TOT and the pension obligation bond savings. Although we negotiated a 2-year interest-only payment situation on the pension obligation bonds, you don't capture any additional savings in the second year. You just avoid any additional costs in the second year. So if the economy isn't rebounding or it worsens, we don't have either of those tools in the toolbox to pursue in fiscal year 22. On top of that, I'd argue that we're cutting services pretty deep in terms of our people to get to these numbers and to have the city remain healthy and last through fiscal year 21. As I've said many times, this isn't just about getting to June 30 of 2021. It's about getting to June 30 of 2022. We have to be thoughtful about that. It's quite possible that in fiscal year 22, we are going to need to draw more on reserves than our strategy for the upcoming fiscal year. And so it's all the more important that we maintain these reserve levels as long as possible before we start to deplete those funds. The council will recall that that I had recommended and that we have been holding the general fund reserve as our option to cover any shortfall in the current fiscal year. We had projected a $1 million shortfall as late revenues are coming in. Kathy and I are still refining that number so we can report it out as part of our general fiscal outlook to you at your next meeting. But we will be drawing down some of the general fund reserve to complete the current fiscal year, and we are proposing some of it be used to cover next fiscal year. So these are very challenging times for the city. Before I do impact service levels, this might be an opportunity if anyone has any questions. Otherwise, the next part of my presentation is to talk about the impact on services.
Are there questions on this section? We did go over some of this at our last meeting, but are there further questions? No. All right, seeing none. And just for the public to know, we spent a lot of time in advance of these meetings having one-on-one conversations with the city manager about a lot of these issues to clarify some concerns. So if it sometimes looks like we're not asking questions, it's because many of those questions have already been asked and answered and clarified, just like what Councilmember Candell just did earlier. So, all right, let's move on.
So just before we move on, I just want to, because what you just said, Catherine, is exactly right. We have gone through a lot of this stuff in various conversations. It's very important that we maintain as best we can in the short term level of service. Secondarily, to preserve the reserve funds, because I do worry about where things are going to look in 18 months. So this seems to be an appropriate strategy, but we're going to have to keep a very stern eye on everything as we go forward in the next 12 to 18 months.
Before I move on, just so for the benefit of the public, the one-on-ones that I have with council, the questions you ask often inform the presentation that I make. So
Yeah.
in fact, there's many points that I've made so far that are based on the questions you've asked me, and that's how I usually work with the information. So we do get, your questions help us inform the community. I didn't want to, I'm holding anything back. Okay.
No, absolutely not. I just want to make sure the public knows that we're playing a long game here. We're trying to maintain a level of service, but we want to make sure that our community succeeds in the long term, and that's a big part of our objectives fiscally.
Gabe, did you have a question? It looked like you raised your.
Yes, thank you. Just a very brief one. Dan, our last meeting, we were talking about Measure A and how we might use those for park maintenance. And I'm wondering if we could revisit that if that's a part of this. I'm not sure that those are in the in the general fund, but you had mentioned that as one of the things Public Works might do to divert that revenue source.
Yeah, so Public Works is in discussions with the county about how they would document shifting the Measure A money into operations to help cover maintenance of the parks. It'd be roughly $75,000 that would come in. And probably based on whatever feedback Julian Skinner has for me and Kathy will incorporate, our final numbers will reflect whatever determination. It's our understanding we can do that.
Okay, let's keep going. Getting to June 30th, 2022.
Okay, so the important thing to outline for the council and the community is what does this actually mean in terms of how we're going to do business. So I'd like to go through various divisions and departments to give you a sense of what we expect. Our priority is our emergency response and the health and safety of the community. So in our Public Works Maintenance Division, as I mentioned, is part of our first responder group. And it will not be impacted. We will maintain our full contingent of employees, and we will call them out in an emergency and, of course, pay them appropriately for that. So the public can rest assured that our ability to act and respond in a flood condition or to put signage out because the power's been shut off by PG&E for several days, those things will continue as you've experienced them in the past. What will change in the maintenance division is general maintenance will be less frequent. That's because what we've worked out with our maintenance crew is that to accommodate the furlough, the maintenance crew is going to work 9-hour days, 4 days a week. So we won't have maintenance crew present for general work on Fridays. They would only be coming in for emergency work on Fridays. And so that will affect our rotation schedule of how we deal with maintenance in the parks, medians, and landscaping around town. So folks are going to see probably some more weeds. We may, if we can, supplement our crews if money is available on a temporary basis to really attack these things. In fact, we're probably going to do that here shortly because we know this recent spot of rain has done a number on our areas, but we will be doing it less frequently. Our Public Works Engineering Division, because most of the funding that the engineering division works with is outside the general fund. We are maintaining our current staffing levels. That said, as I mentioned in our last meeting, we've often absorbed portions of the design and management costs of projects in the general fund to allow more money to be available for construction, even on projects where we had the option to bill more of the design and management costs. We will need to do that cost recovery to help defray the expense of having a robust engineering division that's dealing with the tens of millions of dollars projects that we're currently managing. So that will probably have marginal but not insignificant impact on some construction budgets for some projects. This won't affect the bridge project, and it won't affect the Measure B funded road rehabilitation project. Those projects, the funds are exclusively for construction that we receive from the dedicated sources. So we're talking more about a lot of our smaller six-figure projects that we do around town. As we move into the planning division, we start to talk about more significant impacts caused by these staffing changes that are proposed. The planning division currently is 3 full-time employees, and they often supplement with a consultant when they're particularly busy. They'll basically be 2 full-time employees who are management employees who have a number of duties across both current planning, so that's project-based planning, and then advanced planning, which is thinking about our codes and our general plan and engaging in policy level work. As a result of the fact that the assistant planner will need to be splitting time with the building division, we can anticipate that our ability to respond to the public will take longer. We will continue to acknowledge inquiries when they're submitted, but our ability to analyze and provide a detailed response, there will be delays in doing that. And folks who work in the planning and building area know that longer responses, the professionals who work in these disciplines are not real happy when it takes longer to get an answer from the city staff. We can also anticipate that processing times in the planning division will slow some. Now, we have always offered and will be able to continue to offer that applicants can pay to have these projects expedited. We can bring in a third-party planner to do that. But folks need to know that if time has more value to them than cost savings, then they're going to be building into their project budgets the premium that it costs to have a third-party planner expedite a project. And then because we're bringing code enforcement in-house, we will be attending to code enforcement, but we can anticipate slower response times. Right now, we are able to acknowledge code complaints quickly and then assign them to our third-party provider who's been dealing with them. We'll acknowledge complaints when they come in, but our ability to respond to them will be something that the director will have to weigh as he looks at the workload and the priorities at any given time. And what the code enforcement entails, nuisance code enforcement in particular, we may have to slow our response times there. We will, of course, continue to respond quickly to code enforcement issues that have a health and safety component. The building division, because we now will be having 1 permit technician, and we will then have the assistant planner supplementing in that area. We can also expect that longer response times for general inquiries. And for the more complicated permits, it'll probably take us more time to process them. Now, based on what you saw in the budget projections for revenue, Kathy and I have generally assumed that a lot of the permit activity will actually be work that's smaller in scale, so be a lot of ministerial or over-the-counter approvals. So that should continue at a reasonable pace. But if you bring something more complicated in, it's going to take us longer to work through it. I will say as a caveat, we are continuing with our process to upgrade our land management software. That's the software that allows us to process all our applications. And building is probably the area where we can capture the most efficiencies in terms of moving online and doing digital processing. So we may be able to offset this once we have our new software package up and running. In administration, we're going to shift the assistant to the city manager and the administrative assistant to a strong emphasis on communication. They're already doing communication, but it's always been allocated as roughly a third of duties. We'll probably have to increase that because the other departments will need to rely on those two employees to help them with their communication needs. When we're at full staffing, the departments do a lot of their own media posts, for example, and we may be doing more of that from a central position. What that means is an actual impact, particularly to the council. Over the last couple of years, we've been very pleased and proud to significantly increase our ability to respond to and analyze special issues and projects that arise because of interest in the community or interest in the broader Marin community. Those are typically assigned to administration and are often assigned to the assistant to the city manager. And her ability to take on those special issues and projects will be significantly decreased. So a lot of these types of issues will just have to either rely on the work of other cities or defer a deep analysis to when we start to recover and restore some of our staffing levels. We've probably been most challenged in imagining what our library and recreation divisions of our newly created community services department are going to look like in the COVID-19 world. We talked a bit about this at your last meeting. We are proposing significant reductions in staffing, particularly in the library. Both because we anticipate significantly scaled down operations because of COVID-19 and also in response to the city's financial outlook. So what does that mean? As I showed you in prior slides, when we're fully staffed in the library, our regular employees, our full-time employees, include the director, and then he has 5 reports underneath him. We're proposing in this budget that we will have the director and 2 reports. The reports will have their hours scaled back, and then the director will be splitting his time between both the library and the recreation divisions. So as a result, some of the responsiveness to inquiries, such as reference inquiries and general inquiries to the library, may be delayed. Although I want to acknowledge that the public's done a great job of adapting to the online library, and the staff's been able then to be a little more responsive because a lot more of the inquiries are coming in by email and other means. So we'll make up some of that deficiency because of online resources. We're going to be open a lot less. I think that'll be true even after some of the restrictions are lifted that are imposed by COVID-19. We just won't have the financial means to operate the library at the number of hours that we've enjoyed in the past. I can't tell you what those hours look like yet. Franklin Escobedo, the soon-to-be community services director, and I are talking quite a bit about what these operations are going to look like. And I think it's really important to emphasize here that What we decide are operations on June, whatever date in June, we're allowed to open the library. And what we think operations look like some date in September this year could be very different, because we're going to be constantly adapting and balancing what we are capable of paying for against whatever restrictions are still in place from the public health officer. As part of these limited hours, and I'll be talking a little bit more about this later in the meeting under the item about adapting to COVID-19, we'll be focusing on the circulation of material more than anything else. So the library will not be a gathering place. It will not be a study hall. It will essentially be a place to come and get the material that you've requested online, or under controlled situations and circumstances, we will be allowing some browsing of the collection. But the doors won't be readily open for folks to just wander into the library. And that's a combination of, we'll be at such a limited staffing level, our ability to manage the space will be constrained, combined with the fact that if one of the great things about having the world's best little library is its charm and coziness, but charm and coziness also don't go hand in hand very well with social distancing. So that'll be an evolving discussion as we go through this process. So in the recreation division, again, we're going to staff at levels that are dictated by a combination of the COVID-19 situation and the financial outlook. This budget proposes that the 2.5 employees currently allocated in recreation be reduced to 1 employee. That employs the recreation supervisor. As you can imagine, when you go from 2.5 employees to 1, you're going to have challenges being as responsive. We'll try to supplement that some with the support from the communications team and administration, but we will be challenged there. One of the reasons we feel we can still operate recreation at such a low level is because of the COVID-19 restrictions. We are hearing that we will have to restrict camps considerably in terms of how many children, or in the case of programming for adults, how many adults can participate. The numbers will be small. The constraints on that operation will be small. So we don't anticipate that we will run any programming out of recreation ourselves. We'll be relying entirely on doing contract arrangements with third parties. We do that for the most part now, so from a operation standpoint, that's something we're familiar with. Most of our programming in recreation is done by a third party, where we do a cost sharing arrangement for them to use our facilities and to brand under our name. But that programming will be limited because of the COVID-19 situation. And that means significant loss of revenue for the city, because when we do the programming with a third party, we do a revenue sharing agreement, and the city typically sees a return of 35% of the charge that's levied for that particular program. At this time, we have no idea what, if any, rental income we can anticipate. And rental income is another significant thing that bolsters our ability to operate the recreation division. Rental income runs the gamut from the Hall Middle School gym and the all-weather field at Hall Middle School that we operate when the school hours end, to using the volleyball court at Piper Park, to renting picnic tables, to have birthday parties, and renting space where you can put your bouncy house. We don't know when and if we'll be allowing that sort of gathering to occur in our parks, and what, if anything, rental income will look like. So we have to anticipate and scale down in the department. Now, commensurate with that is that our need to police the rental activity is also scaled down considerably. We also can anticipate that we'll have few, if any, city-managed events with only 1 employee. The city tries to run several events a year under the guidance and direction of the Recreation Department. We'll probably try to keep one or two alive, particularly the ones that are part of our tradition here in Larkspur. But a lot of the newer programming may have to be put on hiatus. A lot of the newer events that we've launched the last few years may need to be on hiatus if we don't think we can manage them. And then much like the library will now lose its working director, who will now have to focus on both departments, the Recreation Division is losing its working director and will have more of a administrative leader in the new director position. Now that said, I do want to acknowledge, having talked with Franklin about the future Community Services Department, this may be an opportunity where we try to capture synergy between the library and recreation, and as a result, we're able to offer some new ways of doing programming that we haven't thought about before. So during this slower period, it's a great time for the library staff and the recreation staff to be contemplating what that new combined department might be able to do that is new and unique. So I do want to wait and see what they can come up with.
Dan, this is Kevin. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, just on the city-sponsored events, and I guess it's more of a Chamber of Commerce sponsored event, but the July 4th parade is canceled at this point, right?
Yes. The July 4th parade is managed by the Corte Madera Chamber, with the
right.
Corte Madera and the city providing the support. And the local events of its have been canceled across the county.
Right. Okay. So I guess this isn't really part of this discussion, but one thing I'd like to explore is possibilities of maybe doing something comparable, because that's a big tradition in our community. Even if we have to do it, without anybody on the street. It's kind of like the way the sports programs are opening up internationally. They're playing baseball without anybody in the stands. So it's not part of this conversation. It's a separate conversation. But I'd like to have a placeholder, at least to have that be thought about.
I think that's for. I appreciate that, Kevin. I think that's for a different day in which we also share a cooperative arrangement with our Twin City Corte Madera. So that would be a broader conversation.
No. I understand that, but it does involve our city in terms of street management and all that kind of stuff. So I'm loath to kind of give it up completely. So let's have that conversation later.
So are there questions? Are you finished with this section of your presentation, or are there a few more slides?
I'm almost done. This section's done though. But before we, I really do feel like I should make one comment about the Vice Mayor's statement.
All right.
Both the staffs of Corte Madera and Larkspur are as disappointed that we can't have the July 4th parade that we know and love. And we have talked a lot about what we can and can't do, but we need to be mindful of the fact that we've been strictly told by the public health officer not to facilitate gathering on July 4th. So
I understand.
We do have some thoughts, but almost anything we do, we almost can't advertise because then people will gather. So we are talking about things we may or may not be able to do. I don't want people to think the staff have just dismissed it, because we do want to say something, but it's a real challenge.
I appreciate those challenges, and maybe I'm just expressing my own personal disappointment that we're not able to do it. But if there are some workarounds that we can accomplish, and again, this is not for this conversation. I understand that, Kevin, but let's have some further thought about it.
But I think that's the overall theme that we need to remember and remind ourselves that we are working under the requirements and prohibitions and prescriptions of the Marin County Public Health Department. And we have to be flexible and fluid, that those things change based on the science and the information that they acquire. So while we're looking at a higher level, a lot of limitations and a lot of changes in our service area, we also have to be mindful that this could go on longer than we think, or it could be shorter than we realize, depending upon how the this COVID-19 crisis is averted further. Keep going, Dan Schwartz.
Okay.
Sorry for the distraction.
That's okay.
Hey, look I was looking forward to that parade too, so I hear you.
I'm at the, I'm in the finishing stretch here. This is a slide I had up for you at the last meeting, and I felt it was important to emphasize it again. The best way I know how to approach the situation we're in is to be pessimistic, because that fuels my thoughts on the budget. It fuels Kathy's approach to the budget. And it's our fervent hope that we are wrong. And it's great to be the wrong pessimist. You don't want to be the wrong optimist when it comes to budgeting in a financial crisis. So I will be very happy if I'm wrong. And so to that end, we will initiate quarterly reviews with the council of the city's financial outlook at council meetings, so that everyone has a chance to understand what we're seeing. As I've mentioned in a few of these presentations, a lot of our revenues that are volatile right now, particularly sales tax, are on a lag or a delay before we see them, and it makes it difficult to see trends when you have such unusual circumstances we're experiencing right now. Sales tax lags by about 2 months. So Kathy and I are only now getting to see the very early impacts of COVID-19 on the sales tax base in terms of real data. We've been speculating and using information we did have available. Now the very first glimmers of real data are coming in. So quarterly check-ins will be critical, and adjusting our assumptions based on what we're seeing quarterly will be very important. And then, if revenues rebound, these are not service levels that we want to provide. We want to provide, frankly, I think no city can reach its optimal service levels. That's a challenge fiscally. But I think we were doing a pretty darn good job, and people were working very hard for the community, and they will continue to work very hard for the community. So restoring hours so they can be more productive if the funds start to come back. And then, of course, adding staff back, particularly in the operations where scale is relative to how busy we are, so particularly in planning and building. So we will be monitoring this with you and the public on a regular basis going forward. And now I turn it over to you, Madam Mayor.
So I think I'd like to reflect on an email I received this week wanting a community member a little concerned that we were not providing enough detailed information. We are providing the extraordinary amount of detailed information. It's all available here, and you can look back on our City Council discussions and questions on the YouTube channel that we have to review all of this. And going forward, we're asking people for their patience. And then as we move through this crisis, as it seems to level off and wane, we will be looking at ways in which the community can step up to help in this. Not only do they need to be patient with what's going on and flexible with all these changes that we have, but Kevin and I have been discussing, and some of the other council members, ways in which we can have community participation to help alleviate some of these reductions of service areas. And there'll be more to that as we go along. Now, do we have any questions from the city council members of this presentation? it's a lot of material, I realize, so.
Madam Mayor, not a question, but a compliment to Dan and Kathy and our city staff for doing everything that they do and for continuing to preserve a real sense of conservatism in our our approach to fiscal management. It's held us in good stead, and it's going to continue to hold us in good stead for the next couple of years until everything just goes to pot. But I think right now we're in good shape. So thank you so much.
And I think that that also speaks to the legacy of Larkspur being fiscally conservative. The councils that came before this one and the managers that came before this one usually were very hesitant to go into debt. And now we realize that having lower amounts of debt helps you ride out a storm a little bit better. Plus, they also held reserves and were very protective of reserves. And so I think we need to give a shout out to that tradition of what we have. But we are going to have a lot of changes coming up, and the community and our staff are going to have to be working together to make sure we weather this storm and keep everyone as safe and healthy as possible.
Yeah, it's rough waters, but we're doing good. We're doing good.
Like I said years ago, wouldn't it be nice if we could just print money like the federal government seems to? But
well, there was a tradition earlier in our country where everyone did that, so maybe we should renew that.
Well, it's also important to realize that the League of California Cities and our North Bay Division is working really hard with Jared Huffman, our Congress representative, to find ways that hopefully funding from the federal government can come to smaller cities like ours. At this point, the CARES Act is only going to cities of 500,000 or more. So it may change. We'll see how it continues within the legislative process that we have very little control over. So
I have a question, Madam Mayor.
Yes, Dan Hilmer.
This has, it's not so specific to this presentation, but it reflects back to our retreat. And at the time we had the retreat, we weren't anticipating the current circumstance we now find ourselves in. But we did talk about shared services during our retreat. And I just wonder if Dan could just give us his opinion, maybe in the long term, if you think this current conditions are going to be encouraging for us to look for ways to share services, or do you think our current circumstances are going to cause us to be more protective of our own resources and be less inclined to be more open to sharing services between jurisdictions? It's just a vibe, I guess I'm asking to get your feeling about.
So the Marin managers have a group, meets now minimum twice a week, of all of the city managers. And we launched a process last month to look at every service category within our cities as a collective to see what cooperation or shared service opportunities there are. So I guess in the broad sense, the answer to your question is I think we're all looking for those opportunities. I think the challenge that we're running into is some of these areas that we've talked about might lend themselves to sharing services, say recreation or a library. But something like planning, it's really tough to envision shared services because the municipal codes and general plans are so different between the communities. The public works directors are talking about possibly doing more shared bidding to bring the cost of projects down. And I think there's a lot of merit to exploring that. Our director, Julian Skinner, has in particular been talking with some of his cohort here in the South County about where they're going to have vacancies, where we might have vacancies, and whether or not, at least in the short term, if not for a longer term, there's a chance to sell services to one another to get through all of this. And that's a particularly interesting question in the engineering area, because longtime watchers of municipal government know that hiring engineers can be really challenging. They're in high demand in the public and private sector. And then hiring engineers here in Marin is doubly challenging. And so some of the cities actually have some vacancies in their engineering ranks, and there's potentially an opportunity there to share engineers that they're exploring. And then, of course, we're always looking at opportunities in public safety to capture both savings and economies of scale. I should say, I did want to actually finish on that point. I want to really acknowledge the work of Scott Schertz and Reuben Martin and the Fire Authority to build the relationship with the Kentfield Fire District. And if folks may not be aware, we actually now have a number of service sharing agreements with the Kentfield Fire District. Our Larkspur, Corte Madera, and Kentfield are all benefiting quite a bit right now by sharing, particularly at the command level, sharing staff.
That was going to be my comment, was would this lead to more innovative ways of sharing services as opposed to reducing our local decision making? So thank you for that information.
Well, I hope so. And I think all of the MCCMC and the Mayor's Select Committee will be meeting next week. And I hope to put forward more of those ideas of how we can do that reasonably. Because I think sometimes with hazard comes opportunity. So if we can, but it often requires political leadership, not just city management leadership. So we all need to be thinking about those ways in which we can keep providing safety and security and services. And if it means creating more opportunities to share them, we'll need to start thinking those through creatively. Are there other questions on this section? All right, seeing none. I guess this is a very key topic. Allison, is there anyone in the community that has raised their hand to ask a question or make a comment?
I'm looking for any raised hands, and I see none at the moment, and no emails have been submitted during this presentation.
Okay. Now that everybody has heartburn, should we move on to the next section? We're going to conduct a workshop to review proposed capital improvement projects for fiscal year. I just want, before we go on, just to make sure members of the community who are listening or may later, there is a budget comparison sheet. That's a line item sheet that was in our packet tonight that is available online for further review.
So, Madam Mayor, I am going to disappear, I think, and Julian Skinner is going to appear. I'll still be here. I just won't be a picture on the screen.
So just so everyone knows what that means, is this GoToMeeting webinar that we are using as a platform for these online meetings allows 5 face screens to come up, but allows over 1,000 people to participate within the background and to listen through auditory and to ask questions and to raise their hands, etc., and to send messages, but it only does have 5 faces. Just to clarify that. Welcome, Julian, or he's not here yet. He's coming.
Good evening. I am here. Can everybody hear me and see my screen?
We can see your screen, but not you.
Okay.
And we are moving on to 8.1B to conduct a workshop to review proposed capital improvement program, the CIP, for fiscal year 2020 and 2021. And that's agenda item 8.1B, which also has a packet online for further analysis by community. Go ahead, Julian.
Okay. Good evening, Public Works Director Julian Skinner. Good evening, Madam Mayor, members of council, members of the public. Tonight we have a presentation on the proposed capital improvement program for fiscal year 2021 through 24-25. It's a 5-year program. There's no resolution or action requested of council tonight other than to receive the presentation and provide feedback so that we can return to you in June with a capital program for adoption. So quickly an agenda here, I'll talk a little bit about the CIP, what it is. We'll talk a little bit about the funding, maybe a little bit more so tonight than we ordinarily would. And then I'll go into the specific projects in the CIP. So when we're talking about our capital improvement program, we're talking about maintaining our infrastructure. Again, so this is the streets and everything that goes along with the streets, street lights, traffic signals, retaining walls, signs and striping, as well as the utility under the streets that the city owns, that's the storm drains. We also look after our one regional park, that's Piper Park, 10 mini parks, and then we have 9 buildings. So how we build the CIP is we identify projects through various things such as condition studies. As you know, we recently had a storm drain master plan completed that identified needs in our storm drain system. We also have planning documents such as our bike and pedestrian master plan. From time to time, there are grant calls for projects for funding, either through Bay Area or local or state organizations. And then other projects that come up due to emergency response, such as a slide repair. So to talk about the funding, what I've done here is list the majority of the funding that goes into our capital improvement program. We do get questions about a lot of news out there about declining revenues and people asking how can we continue with all of our projects while we're at the same time talking about declining revenues. And so the funds that go to into our projects are to varying degrees affected by COVID-19. And so what I've attempted to do here is list those funds and describe which ones may be impacted and which ones may not be and which ones certainly will be. So the first one is our grants. So most of these are already secured, the bridge funding and a TDA grant we have for some bicycle improvements. Those monies have already been allocated and set aside previously, so they will not be impacted directly. Gas tax is one that definitely will be impacted by COVID-19. This is a tax on gasoline sales, so we know people are driving less either because of shelter in place or other reasons related to COVID-19. We anticipate gas tax revenues to go down. The citywide paving fund is an established fund that the city has to use on our Measure B paving projects. That money is sitting there, it is secured. However, it is being repaid by the 3/4 cent sales tax that was the Measure B ballot measure. So the money exists there today to pave the streets, and I'll talk about it a little bit later on, but the payback of that bond in the future may be affected if we have a long-term downturn in the economy. Transportation Authority of Marin has a number of different revenues that we use, measures A, B, and AA. Measures A and AA are transportation sales tax. So again, they will be affected by sales tax declines. Measure A is actually finished and the new version of it is Measure AA. So the Measure A money that we already have is already secured, we have it. So we'll be looking at some decreases in Measure AA moving forward. Measure B is a surcharge on vehicle registration fees, and we only receive that money once every 3 years, or we're not scheduled to receive it for another 2 years. So at the moment, we don't anticipate there'll be any impacts there. County Parks Measure A is also a sales tax. So we're anticipating that will be impacted by COVID-19. VIF, or vehicle impact fees, has 2 components to it. One is the refuse franchise fee, and the other is a surcharge on building projects to account for the wear and tear on our streets. And so we feel the refuse portion of that fund is okay, but we are anticipating some decline in the construction fee. As the city manager mentioned previously, I'm not sure what's going to happen moving forward with building permits. And so obviously as those decline, the impact fees on those will also decline. PG&E Rule 20A funds, those are already allocated by PG&E. They are not impacted by COVID-19. And then restricted revenue is some different sources that come from either other agencies or other grants. And depending on what those services or those agencies are and where that revenue comes from, they may or may not be impacted. And so talking about the projects that you'll see in a 5-year plan, typically we're looking at larger scale work. This is not routine maintenance. These could be projects that span multiple years. And so they may have allocations of funding in this fiscal year and may also be anticipated to continue down the road. And so how we build a capital improvement program is we take those project needs that I described earlier from either the reports or the emergency needs, and we match them with those available funds. Typically, there's way more needs than there are funds, so we do a prioritization based on need. And some of the grant funding we get has time restrictions, so that kind of dictates project schedules. We do forecast out 5 years, but we revisit that plan every year. And in addition, if something comes up in the middle of the year, we can always amend the budget, the program with a city council resolution. And so, as I mentioned, we have more needs than funds, and so we do also maintain a list of unfunded projects. So I'm going to drill down into this year's capital improvement program. We have 3 categories: buildings, parks, and streets. We only have 1 current project in the buildings category. It's fire station improvements. We have not identified any funding for the improvements to date. We did previously allocate $20,000 for some investigative work, and we've spent a little bit of that. What you see across the screen here is the columns are the fiscal years, each of the 5 years of the plan. The first column that has the 20,000 in is the funds that have been allocated to that project previously. I've highlighted in yellow the proposed allocation this year, and then the future years follow beyond that. So as you can see, we're not proposing any allocation to the fire station project this year. The next category is our parks projects. And so although there are 7 projects listed here in the capital improvement program, as you can see by the yellow column here, we're not proposing any new funding this year. Those first 4 projects that are listed have some carryover funding from previous years. And so we will continue with some of the project development and doing some of the design work for some improvements in those parks, but we're not planning on funding the construction money at this time. And as you can look out in years 21, 22, and from then on, we do have some future allocations proposed. But the message here for the parks projects is that we've deferred any construction funding from this year out into future years. So the bulk of where our allocations are this year is in the street projects, or transportation, drainage, and utilities. That's the TDU acronym there. And so I've got 3 pages of street projects. The first page is the projects that are proposed to receive funding this year. The first 4 that are highlighted in red are being funded for the first time this year. The first 2 projects, Measure B, Group 3, and Eastern Francis Drake, were included in last year's budget as proposed allocations for this year. The next 2, Citywide Storm Drain and the Parkway Storm Drain, are new projects for this fiscal year's CIP. The next 5 projects were included in previous CIPs. They had allocations before, and now we're at the point in those projects where they need additional money. Most of these monies were projected as being needed last year. I have slides that detail these projects further on. First, I'll talk a little bit about Measure B. This is the funding table that we came up with when we did the 5-year paving plan. And so I've updated here to have a red strike through on the projects that are already funded and underway. The projects in green here are the ones that are included in this year's allocation request. Project 3, the reconstruction 2 and 3 projects, and then the Sir Francis Drake project. So after your allocations this year, that only will leave 2 remaining projects in the Measure B 5-year plan. That's Project 4 and SS, which is the slurry seal project. And here's the map. It's the same map we showed when we did our Measure B update earlier this year. So these are the streets that are proposed to be paved in the next fiscal year. So we're about to start Measure B Group 3 construction out in the field in a week or 2. That's not these streets. These are the streets you're being asked to fund to be paved next year. The next new project you saw on there was the Parkway storm drain. And so, as I mentioned previously, we did a storm drain master plan. Lots of improvements identified in there. So we've prioritized with the limited amount of funding that we have. We've identified this project as something that we need to do sooner rather than later. This is an excerpt from the plan. What it shows here is new storm drain in green that would replace the red storm drain that's in the street. And the significant item here is that red storm drain goes in between houses and on private property. And so there's a desire to replace that storm drain with new pipe out in the street. Makes it easier to service. And also the pipe is proposed to be upsized, which was a result of the modeling that the consultants did for the storm drain master plan.
And just
Yes.
to give reference to where that is, because I had to look that up. It's across from Centennial Park. You can see on this picture where those tennis courts are. Those are our tennis courts, correct, on Alexander, right?
That's correct. So this is on Magnolia at the south end of the city.
Near Ardmore, and across from that corner where Centennial Park is. So just for reference for people, I had to look that up. I needed to find that. We're missing Dan Hilmer unless he's just dropped his visual. Okay.
I'm here. I just let Julian have the screen.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. The next project that's on the list is a storm drain inspection project. This was one of the things that was identified in the storm drain master plan. The photo on the left here is a typical corrugated metal pipe after it's been in the ground for a certain amount of time, and they tend to corrode, especially the areas that have closer to the creek and have some salinity in the water. And so we have a lot of corrugated metal pipe within our system. And we've done some preliminary evaluations, but in order to prioritize and determine which sections need to be either replaced or repaired, we need to do some more thorough inspections, and that involves running a camera through those storm drain lines. And so we're proposing $100,000 in the budget to do that work. So those were the projects that were being funded for the first time this year. And now I'm moving on to some projects you've seen before, but it was time to add more funding to them. The first is a Doherty Drive Rule 20A undergrounding project. So the map section here shows Doherty going across the street, across the screen. And the two yellow highlighted areas here are where there is still overhead power, cable, and phone that we propose to underground. So PG&E has what's called a Rule 20A program where they set aside funds for each agency to then be used to underground overhead utilities on eligible corridors. And so Doherty was identified as being eligible for these funds. And PG&E is about 90% through the design work on this project. And so we're anticipating that this actual construction work would take place this fall, and that would include putting new conduits under the pavement and putting those overhead lines in those conduits, so we didn't need the overhead power lines anymore.
And that amount looks like it's 1.7 million.
That's PG&E's total estimated cost for that project at the moment, which coincidentally is how many credits we have with PG&E in that program. So that will exhaust all of our Rule 20A credits. It also so happens that PG&E is reevaluating the Rule 20A program, and it may not exist after this year. So we only get about $40,000 a year added into that fund. So it would really take a long time, even if the fund were to continue to accumulate enough money for another project.
I'm sorry, Madam Mayor, can I ask a question on this?
Yes, Scott.
So I'm looking at the handout, and I think this is 18-302. We have $875,000 of proposed funding. I'm assuming that's from the city, so this isn't fully paid by PG&E. Is that right?
No, it's all paid by. It's all money that's held by PG&E. So the only
when I'm looking, go ahead.
The only portion of city funding that will be in this project is for the staff support time. But the design work, the construction management, all comes from those PG&E Rule 20A credits.
So when I'm looking at this chart and it says $875,000 proposed funding for Doherty Drive Rule 20A Underground, am I reading that wrong to think the city is going to be paying $875,000 for this project?
So the money, these projects go a couple of different ways. As it actually turns out, we are in a pilot program with PG&E, and they are acting as the project lead, which means this money actually will not pass through the city. But typically, if we were not in the pilot program, and the way we've kept it shown in the capital budget is we would hire a contractor, we would do the work, and we would be reimbursed by PG&E that $1.7 million typical of a grant program. So one of the slides later in the presentation shows the funding per project, and it has a category for each sets of those funds. So even though they may be city funds, they're coming from another source. It's not coming from the city's general fund. It's not coming from gas taxes. It's coming strictly from PG&E Rule 20A credits.
Okay, thank you.
So Julian, about following up on that, am I correct when I remember that these Rule 20As that came from PG&E were to be able to create poles undergrounding for public safety evacuation routes? Was that part of the origin of that?
Yeah, that's part of the analysis, and so PG&E set aside this money to help local agencies underground their overhead utilities, and they have a criteria that has to be met for a corridor to be eligible to use the Rule 20A credits, and typically it is a collector or arterial or a major street within a city that's used typically for evacuation routes or something where you want to lessen the amount of obstructions next to the road for vehicles to impact.
Or down power lines or down power poles.
Correct.
Something. So past this one section by Redwood High School, we enter into Corte Madera jurisdiction. Are there poles throughout that area? I can't recall. Or have they underground also? Only that the continuity between going along there to get to Highway 101, there's a continuity of flow between our jurisdiction and Corte Madera's jurisdiction.
Yeah, that I'm not sure. I drive that street every day, and I can't say whether I noticed if there's poles there or not. But the section of Doherty that you see on the map here, where we've got the yellow at the both ends, the whole section in between there is already undergrounded, and so the middle portion of Doherty was previously undergrounded, and now we're completing the city's portion at each end with this project.
All right, thank you. I'll look tomorrow when I'm out walking
Yeah,
around.
Catherine, it's Kevin. Just to, I believe it's all undergrounded in that section, partly because of the work that they did at Warnham some little bit of time ago, and with the condo complex going in there, I think it's pretty much all undergrounded in that section. So, but tell me if I'm wrong.
Okay, the next project on the list is our Magnolia 88 improvements, which has been in our CIP for a while. We've previously funded the design work for this project, and we anticipate construction taking place in the next fiscal year. And so you're being asked to program the funds for the construction. So this is the main downtown core of Magnolia between King and Ward Streets. And so this project proposes to remove and replace the sections of the sidewalk that don't currently meet ADA standards. Includes the photo here as a ramp, and even though that's a ramp where the sidewalk meets the street, it doesn't meet ADA standards, so that would be removed and replaced with this project, as well as a traffic signal there that would have ADA amenities added to it. And so in doing the preliminary design work for the sidewalk fixes, we've identified a need to pave the street. At the same time, we replace the curb gutter and sidewalk, because the most effective way to correct the sidewalk deficiencies is to change their elevation to a point where the street would need to be repaved anyway. So this section of Magnolia was included in the Measure B 5-year plan, and so what we've done is shifted money from the Measure B Group 3 project, in which the section of Magnolia would have ordinarily been included, and instead proposed to use that funding for this project in the next fiscal year. Coeur d'Alejo Storm Drain is another project that's been on the books for a while. A series of overland storm drain pipes take the drainage from Villa Paz down between 4 homes down to Coeur d'Alejo. They're temporary pipes. They're laying on the slope, and they need to be replaced with a permanent facility. We've come up with 2 different designs. One was for a directional drill, basically following the same alignment as the red surface pipes that you see with the red line. Another is to take a new gravity line down the street, down Villa Paz to Villa Rita. So we have 2 options for that project, and we will likely be going out to bid with both options to see which one comes in most favorable. The last time we went out to bid, the bids came in quite a bit more than the engineer's estimate, and as it turned out, the low bidder actually withdrew his bid anyway. But we didn't complete the construction funding at that time for this project because the low bidder backed out. So now that we plan to advertise this again in the coming fiscal year, we're proposing to add construction funding into this project so we can award a bid after we go out and advertise. And then the last, or the biggest project on here, is the Bon Air Bridge replacement. And so the total funding for this is listed at $37.6 million. As you recall, you awarded a contract for this project a few years ago in the amount of $26.7 million. But this the 37.6 reflects the total project cost. And so that includes all of the preliminary design work, all the environmental work and design work that went into developing this project, as well as the awarded construction amount of $26.7 million. There's also a mandated 10% construction contingency that we're maintaining in the project fund, and then the construction management, which is paying for all of the inspections and oversight during the construction, and that's where that total $37.6 million comes from. And so this project spans over 4 years, and so this is the 4th and hopefully final allotment of money towards this project that's included in the budget request. So those are the projects, the street projects that have funding requests for the next year. This next slide shows the other projects that are in the capital improvement program that have received funding before, and that funding will get carried over because these projects are not complete. So the top one here is the Measure B Group 2 street repair. So you funded that last year with about $7.4 million. That's about to get underway with the paving. So that money will stay with that project until that project's completed. The money gets carried over in the budget. We don't have to reallocate it this year. And that's the same as the rest of the projects that are listed down here. I'm happy to go into further detail with any of those projects that are listed there, but these are all ones that have been included in the CIP and funded before, and they're simply not complete yet, and that's why they're being carried over. The next slide is projects that have not started yet. So these projects are also included in the 5-year CIP. They have not been funded to date. We're not proposing to fund them this year, but as you can see from the columns here, there are future funding allocations proposed. And so just to clarify, when we come back to you in June and ask you to adopt the capital improvement program, you're only actually allocating the funds for this or for fiscal year 2021. Those are the only projects you're actually funding with a budget adoption, but this is a planning tool, and so we do show the projected funding for 4 years out in addition. So these are 5 projects that have been in the CIP before, but you will not see them in the 2021 document. We will have another item at the June meeting that will close these projects out. They will be complete, and all the accounting will have been completed on those projects also, so we'll have a final number. And then any money that's left in these projects gets reverted back into the funds from which they came. But these are all complete projects that will not get carried over into the next fiscal year. And so here's the chart that kind of summarizes your funding requests for 2021. The projects are listed on the left, the same ones I described earlier. The total amount that was discussed before is in the far right column. And what you see here in the individual columns is where that money is proposed to come from. So the bridge fund, gas tax, the citywide paving plan, which comes is the bond money that's being repaid with Measure B, the vehicle impact. And then I've kind of lumped together grants, restricted revenue, and Rule 28 credits in one column. And then TAM local roads, and it looks like there's a bit of a typo here. I'm just looking at something happened in the form here, but I'll correct the last two columns here. The grants, restricted revenue, Rule 28, and the TAM local roads columns look like they've been flipped. So that 392,146 is the TAM local roads that's proposed to go to Corte Alejo storm drain. And then in the final column, the 875 for Doherty and the 8.6 million are from grants or restricted revenue or Rule 28 credits. So I'll make sure to make that correction on the final document. So here's a summary of the funds that make up the 18.3 million proposed allocation. So this is a summary of the columns that you just saw on the table before that make up that total. So again, we're looking at a 5-year CIP, and so this year's allocation is 18.3, but when you look at the program as a whole, there's $81 million worth of projects listed in our 5-year capital program. We've already funded 46.5 million of that in previous years that's being carried over or has been spent. And then the 18 million in proposed new funding this year, and those numbers don't add up because there's also this portion of funding that will occur next year and then through year 5 in the CIP that would add up to the 81. So that's the end of the presentation. So I'm available for any questions. And as I started out, we're looking for your feedback from the council and from the public tonight so that we can come back to you at the meeting in June with a CIP for adoption.
Okay, well, that's a lot to cover. And it's also in our 8.1B attachments for those of you who are following online. So the deferral of the Heatherwood Park project and the Redwood Bicycle Facility Improvement Project. Did I see that in there earlier?
Yeah, it's in the staff report. I didn't detail it in the presentation, but as I mentioned before, we do a 5-year CIP, and so every year we project out what we're going to do in the subsequent years. And so when we did last year's CIP, we had projected that we were going to do Heatherwood and also a portion of the North-South Greenway Bikeway on Redwood this year. But in developing this year's CIP, we've determined that those projects are not ready for funding this year, so we have pushed them out another year. Heatherwood is a victim of our revenue concerns with the County Parks Measure A, so we've pushed that out 1 year. The Redwood Bikeway project is proposed to take place after another project that Caltrans is leading. They will be bringing a new bike path over Corte Madera Creek on the side of the 101 off-ramp. It will touch down on Redwood Highway, and then our Redwood Highway project, which is funded by TAM, would continue that path down to the pedestrian overcrossing on 101. Obviously, Caltrans has not started their project yet, so we don't want to do ours until they're finished their work. So we have to push that project out a year.
So this is a lot of material to cover, and I know we've had a chance to look at it in advance, but do any of the council members have questions of Julian Skinner? Go ahead, Scott.
Julian, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so my question for you is, if hypothetically, due to COVID, we decided that we wanted to delay or postpone 1 or 2 of these projects in order to try to get money in the general fund that could be otherwise used for other reasons, what would you recommend would be one or two projects that you think would be delayed and that the funds would go towards the general fund as opposed to allocated money, grant, something that we wouldn't be able to use for other purposes?
Yeah, so there are few of those, and it, like you said, it goes down to the funding source and which of those projects are funded by flexible funds that can be used for other sources. And so the TAM local roads has already, a request has been made for improvement projects, and that's what they're for. They're for infrastructure. So those funds cannot be funneled to the general fund for anything other than projects. The grant for the Bon Air Bridge obviously has to go to the bridge. We're not able to use that elsewhere. I think your most flexible fund on here is the gas tax. We are able to use gas tax for road maintenance, which could include some of our staff. And then beyond that, most of these funds are project specific. You know, and some of the paving projects that we're doing or some of the other projects, there's added costs of deferral. And a lot of these projects, we're getting to them at a point where there's a certain repair that's identified and it has a cost. Deferring certain improvements and costs can lead to further deterioration of that infrastructure and more costs down the road. And for example, in our Measure B program, we had a couple of streets in our first year that by the time we got to them, they had deteriorated to the next level and they had to be pushed out a year, and they cost significantly more to repair after we didn't pave them 1 year.
So Julian, with the knowledge that you have, which I think is superior to the knowledge that any of us have, are there any of these projects that you think would not incur additional costs if it were delayed a year, as opposed to those that, you know, would be much more expensive 2 years from now than they would be this year?
Yeah, it's hard to say with some of them. You're doing a risk analysis basically when you're talking about the storm drains, because we don't know what condition they're in. So the further you push that down the road, obviously you're increasing the risk if you don't catch something that it could turn into something worse. You know, compromised storm drains can not only lead to polluted receiving waters, but, you know, worst case scenario, you can have collapsed storm drains that lead to sinkholes in the streets and very costly repairs. So, you know, there's some risk analysis in deferring some of these projects. Others of them have timelines that are dictated by the grant funding that we have. We have to get those projects finished by a certain date, or the funding doesn't become available. You know, I would say
I don't want to press you, but it seems like from what you said earlier that the only funds we really have available are the gas tax funds, you know, which limits it to a couple of very limited projects that we would even have the ability to push back and use those funds for other purposes. Are there any of the gas tax funded projects that you think would not cause significant hardship or significant penalties if they were pushed back, you know, for a year or two? And I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm just trying to get to the point.
So if you're looking at the gas tax projects, the bike and pedestrian path improvement, it's a pretty small number, but that's typically for improvements that are smaller in nature, such as if somebody asks for an ADA ramp at a specific location and it's not close to another project. That's a pot of money that we've used for those one-off improvements. And given that we've just done 150 curb ramps throughout town, there's the potential that, you know, that money could be deferred out a year. Again, it's not a big number. I would not recommend deferring the Measure B Group 3 pavement rehab project simply because, as I mentioned, we did have some incurred costs when we saw some streets in year one that had got to a worse condition. I had to bump them into this year's project. Those streets are being more costly now because they need more work done to them. So there is the potential of some of those streets in Group 3, if we defer them out a year, that we will incur more costs to pave them later. I would say the Easter Francis Drake pavement rehab, when we worked with TAM a few years ago to move the lane merge near Bremillard Park, we did, as part of that project, correct a lot of the very bad areas of pavement on Easter Francis Drake. And so that project was penciled in for year 3 of our plan before we had that project completed. And we've kept it there. But I think if I were to choose between those two projects, I think Easter Francis Drake could more likely be pushed out a year without seeing any significant costs increased.
Julian, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yep.
And the
And
Easter,
it's a fantastic proposal. The work you did on this was great. So, and I don't mean to grill you. I'm just trying to, get a more understanding. So thank you.
and that Easter Francis Drake pavement rehab project you just mentioned is scheduled for this summer?
No, it's scheduled for the next fiscal year, probably next summer. But as you know, the county is also proposing to pave their section of Sir Francis Drake. So we'll also be working with them on what timing may make sense so that we work as best we can in conjunction with their project. But as it's proposed now, it's to be funded for construction in the coming fiscal year, but that means paving would occur in summer of 21.
And I'm sorry, just one quick follow-up. Julian, is working with the county, is there cost savings if we work with the county to do this when they do it, as opposed to if we were to put it off and they wanted to do it now and then we did it a year from now, would that be more expensive for us?
The county project is going to be 2 years in duration, so we would have to work with them on what their timing would be. They've got a lot of work in their project beyond just paving, so I'm not sure where in their 2-year time frame their paving lands. Typically, you do it near the end so you don't damage the paving with any of your other work. But certainly, they have already awarded a contract for their work, but we could, as the time comes closer, work with them and their contractor to see if there's any cost savings. We have a common point where our project will meet theirs. There may be some cost savings in shared traffic control or some coordination, that either is a benefit to the public because we lessen the impact overall through the corridor, or we're able to save some funds.
Thank you.
And I think just Scott, to help clarify it even more, I think it's been my experience that Julian, since he joined us in Larkspur 4 or 5 years ago, is it now, has been very effective in working well with the county engineers and the county project people, knowing that that's an important thing that we consider in Larkspur, that we try to coordinate these things for the maximum benefit of resource allocation and also to decrease the inconvenience to our community if we can. Are there other questions of the CIP from the council? It looks like, and I don't see Dan Hilmer because he's off screen, but if he wants to speak up, he can.
Well, I just want to express my gratitude to Julian for all of his hard work and clear descriptions of all the work that he's doing and the relationships to all the larger county issues that we're discussing here.
Thank you.
Allison, is there anyone in the community who has raised their hand and would like to ask a question or make a comment? I see we're down to 16 attendees, so I don't know how many are us and how many are members of the public.
We do still have some attendees, so if they'd like to make a comment, please raise your hand now. In the meantime, we have one written comment received that I'll read. This is from Joe Jennings. Dear Mayor Way, I'm writing to you representing the Commons Foundation and in regard to item 8.1B Capital Improvement Program CIP for 2020-21 in today's agenda. At the August 2019 unfunded CIP City Council workshop, we discussed with the City Council that the $30 million in the CIP for the new library community center was too high. We recommend carrying a first phase building of 10,000 square feet at 1,000 per square foot for a total of $10 million is more reasonable. Our understanding was that the city was going to change the numbers in the CIP to reflect what a first phase building would cost rather than continue to carry this $30 million figure in their planning documents. Thank you for your consideration. Joe Jennings, President, the Commons Foundation.
I believe he's referring to 8.1B attachment 4, which is item 20/3.
Right,
Is
so
there-
I put the presentation back up. I actually did have a last slide that was after the questions for some reason, but so this is a list and it was included in your packet. This is the unfunded projects that I referred to earlier that are beyond our funding sources at this time, and we reevaluate this every year when we look at the CIP, and there was an item in there last year for the library and community center. Item has an ID of 20-3 that's listed at 30 million, and I think I'll acknowledge that there's been some work done since last year's, and I think what we could do here is split this into 2 items maybe, and have an item that's called phase 1, 10,000 square foot library at the 10 million, and then also capture that big vision and call a phase 2 library and community center and have a separate line item for the other 20 million to reflect that request.
I think that sounds reasonable. Are there questions? Are there
one more
questions?
question?
Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, could you tell me, and maybe Dan Schwartz, if you're still around and you can answer this too, are any of these unfunded projects, are there any sources of grants or any other state, federal money that would be available for any of the projects on this list?
Unfortunately, for the bigger items, there are few and far between, and when they do come out, they're very competitive. There is a seismic grant that's available, but unfortunately, that covers only the seismic work that would be required at City Hall, and by the time you start cutting into walls and getting into code issues and ADA, you're looking at what's estimated as about an $8 million price tag for City Hall, whereas the seismic portion of that work is less than $1 million. So you still have the bulk of that project that would be unfunded. As you get into some of the smaller projects, there are from time to time grants. Typically every year there are grants for bike and pedestrian facilities, either Transportation Fund for Clean Air or Transportation Development Act funds. Those are also very competitive. We have been successful in those grants in the past. Some of the work you've seen on Doherty with the flashing lights, and you're about to see on Doherty at Magnolia, were paid for with TDA grants. And then also there is a state park bond fund that's in the works that could potentially provide some money for some of the park improvements too.
Thank you.
Just to kind of give a little background on that, Public Works is always scoping out to look for big grants like this. With the unfortunate economic downturn we're about to face, I think some of these ones that could come from the state are going to be suffering just financial impact as much as everyone else is going to be for a while. Sometimes there's school bonds and funds that come from the state that we have access to, but so far there hasn't been any recent ones that I'm aware of. Is there anyone else, Allison? And then if not, we'll close this.
There's no
I have
further
a
public
question,
comment.
Madam Mayor.
Oh, yes, Dan, I can't see you, so go for it.
I would predict that there are going to be significant changes to the design of the public environment as a result of the conditions that we're witnessing. And I would like that any flexibility to how we can use funds to adapt would be a principle that I think that we should employ as we create strategies moving forward.
Good point.
And I'd like Dan Schwartz to comment on that concept.
Can you hear that?
I did hear it. I'm not sure if you're speaking of a specific project. Certainly, I think Julian and I and Neil Toft, your planning and building director, spent time together in City Hall on Monday, scratching our heads at what City Hall reconfigurations have to occur in light of the new world paradigm here. So we might even have to rethink that project and what a remodel looks like compared to old plans. So if you're referring to something like that, I think the staff's already having those discussions.
Well, I just want to make sure that we have the flexibility to adapt to how we move through all of these changes.
Okay.
I just think that's a good principle to include as we're making decisions about what we're going to do. Because I think there are things we don't know yet that we'll have to and they're going to be significant that we haven't even imagined yet that we're going to have to consider. And I just want to make sure that we're giving ourselves the flexibility to adapt to that.
Well, I think the great thing is the primary two projects the city's focused on are the bridge and the road rehabilitation program, and those should continue as they are.
Yeah, but I think your point is interesting, Dan, because I think we don't know yet as to what changes there will be in public spaces. We know in private spaces that are restaurants, et cetera, there are definitely going to be significant changes. It'll be interesting to see if this sort of creates sort of that wave that we went through with complete streets project ideas, that we really had to look at our public spaces for all the ways that people move about our public spaces. This may be bringing changes like that too in the years ahead, with distancing and appropriate places for people to gather in smaller groups. I don't know. We'll see.
Well, I'm including the community facilities parcel and how we are spending limited resources on, and we're even reorganizing the way the city looks at library community center functions. So I just want to make sure that we're being the most considerate in terms of how our conditions are changing and how we're making decisions moving forward.
Point well taken. All right, that's the end of your presentation, Julian?
That is all I have, yes.
And there's no thing to vote on tonight. This was to conduct a workshop to ask questions and review proposed capital improvement. You'll be bringing this back at our next meeting then for continual approval. Is that correct?
Yes, it will come back in June for adoption. That's correct.
Okay. That brings us down to business item 8.2. So I think Julian jumps off now, and we bring back there. Look at that. This is an update on city activities in response to the COVID-19. This is a standing item we asked to have. We've had a lot of update already throughout the course of the evening in your other presentations, but if there's other things, you can add them here.
I just have a few, Madam Mayor, that I thought I should speak to that are more specific to May 20th than anything else. So first, we've had a lot of folks asking why the Piper Park parking lot is still closed. The new health order transferred the discretion for parking at the parks and recreation areas from the county public health office to the cities themselves. I consulted with the police chief, the recreation director, the public works director about our ability to manage and police gathering in Piper Park. And we were particularly concerned in light of the Memorial Day weekend being upon us. And so I made the decision to keep the parking lot closed at this time. We encourage people who want to come enjoy Piper Park to do so by walking or biking to the park. This isn't a forever decision, but we in particular want to see how things go over the Memorial Day weekend, and we'll be revisiting this decision on a week-by-week basis.
Do we have opportunities for people with disability placards to access part of it? Or is that considered?
Well, if they want to park at the police building, they can do that and walk in. But people shouldn't be using the parking lot.
Okay.
And then, I wanted to emphasize that City Hall is an old building, and we've been studying it. I just mentioned that in the last item. We are working now with our staff and with some vendors and consultants to figure out a way to create a very controlled environment in City Hall. And we anticipate, at least when we first reopen, that it will be by appointment only, that you'll be allowed into the building. We really don't have spaces here where people can queue. So we actually are investing in a product that will allow us to have people queue digitally and receive a text when their appointment comes up, and they would come to the building and be let in. And that will, at least in the early stages of when we're allowed to open the library, it's our intention that browsing in the library will be one person by appointment only for 15 minutes. Generally, we want to encourage folks to do their browsing online, and the staff's going to be doing curbside service during portions of the hours that they're open, so people can pick up their material. We've started getting inquiries about camps because camps are now allowed. We do have some vendors interested in starting to offer camps. People who read the health orders closely may have noticed that they said the camps were only for essential workers. And so we were trying to figure out who's supposed to determine who's an essential worker and who's not. We're hearing that in all likelihood that language will be modified and relieve the camp operator of the burden of figuring out what the background is of the parent. Camps, we think we could, with the cooperation of the Larkspur Madera School District, we think we may be able to offer a very small number of camps very soon, following the guidance of the public health official in the CDC for camps for children, 12 or fewer children being present. And then lastly, as I informed the council at the last meeting, we're really struggling to determine if we can operate the Twin Cities Child Care Facility that's located at the Neil Cummins Elementary School campus in light of the COVID restrictions, and have a lot of concern that we're actually going to be able to operate that facility and have enough revenue come in to offset our expenses. So I will be opening up discussions with the school district about what the options are there. And we're continuing to talk to our child care staff about what they think they might be able to accomplish or not accomplish in the current fiscal environment. Just wanted to share those additional points. They're very specific to where we are in this moment in time. Any questions?
Any questions on those items? And I know you'll be bringing back the Twin Cities Child Care Center discussion at our next meeting.
Soon, Madam Mayor, maybe as soon as the next meeting.
And that was also a topic that was brought up to our finance ad hoc committee that met this week to help give some advice on that as we created this reinvigorated this ad hoc committee back in March. So this was something we've been helping. Vice Mayor Haroff and I have been helping our city manager and city finance director to think through also. Any questions? Oh yes, Gabe, I see a hand.
Thank you, Mayor. Dan, briefly, you had talked last meeting about more investment in digital or IT, and the digital queuing that you just mentioned reminded me of that. Are there any other cost savings or efficiencies or initiatives along that line?
Well, that's our newest one, is we've selected a vendor for that product. We also are actually approaching the end of our free period with the product we're using right now. So the staff's in the process of determining if we want to stick with the go-to product from LogMeIn or if we want to look at one of the other products. We chose the go-to product in part because they offered us 3 months to try it out. And so we're focusing on that one right now. I also spent some time today with our facilities folks. We're mapping out more cameras so we can see everywhere in the city hall, and then probably have some buzzer and an intercom system so that when we want to, we're able to let people in remotely. We also want to offer some sort of touchless or contactless way for people to pick up material after hours. So we're looking into some sort of locker system that may be behind City Hall where we could type in a code, leave plans, for example, for folks so that they can come by and pick them up at their convenience. So technological issues, large and small. We are in the process of soliciting RFPs from vendors for land management software. That's the software that runs our planning and building department. We're actually receiving those RFPs now, so we'll be evaluating them soon. And I'm actually doing background checks on a new IT service to provide our on-the-ground technological support and some higher-level IT management.
Thanks. But in the category of applications, so some of these things are more, like you said, networks and laptops, but possible cloud-based applications or anything that might allow for more remote services. Has there been anything there?
So we actually, we already own a product that we aren't utilizing to its maximum capacity, which is our digital archiving system. And so under Allison Fallis, your city clerk's initiative and direction, the staff is going to be moving rapidly to clean up those digital archives so that we can move them to an online server. And our hope is that a lot of the trips that people make to City Hall are to actually see our hard copy files or to use one of our computers that we allow them to comb through project material and property address-based material. And we're hoping we're going to be able to offer that as a searchable online service in the next 6 months. I didn't really think of that one because we already own that application. We just aren't taking advantage of it to its fullest capability. And the COVID situation has really prompted us to take a new look at our existing technology as well as new initiatives.
Great. Thank you, Dan.
Are there other questions on item 8.2? Okay. Allison, anyone in the audience raising their hand to ask a question about 8.2?
There's no public comment.
All right, that leaves us we've done a lot of this also tonight, the financial update, but this is a standing, what we used to say in the hospital, standing order, so that it's something that we refer to. So the financial update, particularly in reference to COVID-19.
So I wanted to report here on something that's tangential to our own financial situation, but involves the entities that generate revenue for us, the business community. There's been reference tonight already to the work of our chamber to build a partnership with the Larkspur Community Foundation, with the city, with the county to generate a fund to help people during this time. I want to assure folks there's a lot going on behind the scenes at the staff level to create paths and plans for businesses to operate under the restrictions of the public health officer's orders. In particular, a lot of energy right now on restaurants, and when some level of dine-in restaurant activity is allowed, there's a lot of work going on collaboratively between all of the entities in the county to have a guideline and plan to allow some of that activity to move outdoors. You're probably seeing some of that. I know San Jose City Council had a long presentation about it at their most recent council meeting. We're very challenged in Larkspur because a lot of the core restaurants are on one of our main corridors. And so we may not be able to allow quite the level of bleed out into the streets that other communities are able to allow, but we're evaluating that. I've had a lot of folks in the community wonder if we might allow road closures, you know, on at least a limited term basis. We're evaluating whether that's a possibility. So we are looking at these different options to help our businesses out as they navigate this unusual time.
Okay, are there questions on that? And is that something that we can help with through our Chamber of Commerce representatives, or should we take that at a different time?
Well, right now that's a staff level about how do you deal with the Americans with Disabilities Act? How do you deal with right-of-way? How do you deal with utilities underneath the potential bleed out into the street? If some sort of structures needed to be built to protect patrons from who are out there dining, can you build that on top of a utility line? I mean, these are all questions. So it's not that I don't want to participate with the restaurants. I want to, and with the other businesses, I don't want to go to them until I've got a conversation to give them. And right now, we're doing all that research.
And Kevin, it's Kevin, just to reinforce that. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Oh, okay. You know, I think we're having a good, you know, because I kind of wear two hats in this context, both on the chamber and as a member of the city council. But it's really, really important for us to not let folks get too far ahead beyond where the city is able to provide this support. You know, there are other communities that have a different capability, particularly with respect to restaurants, just because of the configuration of their neighborhoods and their downtown areas, than we may have. So we have to be careful. But I think we're doing a good job and working cooperatively between the chamber and the city. And the chamber is, I think, doing a great job in moving forward. And we're trying to explore a number of different possibilities within the business community, and particularly in the restaurant community, over the course of the next 3 to 6 months. But we need to make sure we're very careful about how that gets laid out. So there'll be more to report on that as we go forward.
And I realize we're still awaiting direction also from the Marin Health Department as to what sort of limitations and configuration can happen within confined spaces. So that's
exactly. Everything has to be done kind of it's kind of like a multi-layer chess game here. So we will be figuring these things out, but I think we'll be seeing some impetus within the business community to do some of the things they've done in the past, but do them in a different way, and do them within the constraints that we have from infrastructure in the city as well as from the county.
all right. Are there other questions on this last item? Thank you for that. Allison, I'll ask one last time.
Madam Mayor, only to echo.
Go ahead.
Only to echo Councilmember Harrof's remarks with respect to preserving flexibility with in our ability to adapt to very dynamic conditions. I think that that's going to be the key to our future.
Yeah, I agree.
Right. And we're talking about it every day. So
So
we'll get there.
we're at our last item, which is adjournment. Is there, Allison, this says regular meeting on June 3rd. Is that still correct?
No, it's after the publication of this agenda, that meeting has since been canceled and we'll be meeting on June 8th. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yes, just to let everyone know that there was a conflict, so we needed to move the regular meeting of the first meeting in June to June 8th at the same time, 6:30, but there will be public notice about that. But I just wanted to bring that up right now. And if there's nothing further, I think we will see each other on June 8th unless something comes up in advance. And if you have time tomorrow, sign on to that District 2 Zoom and say hello to Franklin, our librarian. Thank you very much. Good night.
Enough. Thanks. Good night.
And everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone. Nice to see you.